I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we are talking about an essential book for every driver, particularly the young drivers in your family. It is called How's My Driving? Why Every Other Driver Doesn't Seem to Have a Clue. It is written by Steve Dziadik, and he is joining us here today on Spotlight, along with his lovely wife, Mary Ann. Steve and Mary Ann, thank you both so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. It's an important book, like I said. If you're driving, you've got to realize rather, that this is serious business. Tell me a little bit about why you wrote the book.
Well, I used to work for an insurance company. And one of the things that, when you're involved with a particular insurance company, if their ads come on TV, you notice them. And this particular insurance company had an ad that was on TV that showed it was about 45 seconds long, and it showed a couple of teenagers getting ready to go for a prom. And the parents were there with them, they're taking pictures and all this, that, and the other. And then as it moves through, the kids go outside, they get in their car, and parents wave goodbye. And then there's a caption that comes across the bottom that says, over 6,000 teenagers every year leave home and never come back. And I was blown away by that, because where'd they get that number from? And I found out that it was a result of a U.S. News study that was done over 10 years. And the actual number was 60,600 in that 10-year period. Just mind-numbing.
It is mind-numbing, and it's such a horrible thing. And it seems to happen every year to some high school class somewhere, that somebody's driving to the prom or away from the prom, and a young person is killed, or sometimes a whole car full of children are killed or teenagers are killed. It seems the more teenagers are in the car, the more likely that car is to crash.
That's correct.
Which, he did write it for that, but also the main reason, I think, is Steve and I were in a really bad car accident many years ago. And I was 7 months pregnant, and
we lost a child.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We lost the baby. But what happened was my face hit the windshield. So I had many fractures. And then my stomach hit the dashboard. And when we first went to the hospital, and they said, I think I was out for 3 days or something like that. But when I was finally, they're monitoring the baby to see what's what. And I kept saying, no, I feel the baby. And then they said, no. They took tests, and they said, no, the baby is not alive. And I had to go into surgery so they could take the baby, because she was so
deformed. Yeah, it just
so deformed.
It was one of the most traumatic experiences you can imagine. I had no idea then to extrapolate that into how you lose a 16-year-old.
Yeah,
this is an unborn child, and it's affected my wife, as you can see, rather negatively, even these many years later. So
you don't get over it. I don't care how long it's been. And it happened around this time of year. So this time of year is always difficult. But when I woke up from surgery, when they took the baby, and I said, can I see my baby? And the doctor said, see the baby? She was crushed. And that's with me forever.
Yeah.
When I start, it's my fault. What could have I done? But anyway, I know that God did not want us to hurt too much. So he sent us a boy, a year and a half or so later. So, that we're very blessed. But mostly I like to tell this to women, especially pregnant women, to please be careful, because it can go like that. It happens so soon, and you're stuck with it for the rest of your life.
Right. Well, thank God you were able to have another child.
Yes.
And it's also a godsend that you've written this book to warn other people about the dangers of driving and the awesome responsibility that it is. I mean, people need to realize that they're driving around in a machine that's capable of killing, multiple people. And, there's too much speeding on the road. There's too much distracted driving. That's a huge issue right now. And aggressive driving as well. I mean, some people just drive. Sometimes they don't have a clue, and sometimes they're just too aggressive with their driving.
I think one of the things, when you look at the title, how's my driving? That's not a question that I think people ask themselves. Because if they did, they'd say, well, I think my driving is pretty good. They're always looking at the other person saying, what's wrong with them? And the reality is you can't do a thing about the other people. You can only do something about you. And that's why this book is written with that in mind. What can I do that is going to change my performance and my involvement with the people around me? Because that's going to be a positive impact. And you know what it's kind of, I wrote 4 goals in the book, and the number 1 goal was to hope that somebody would not have a crash as a result of reading this. And I always said at the end of it, how do you how do you quantify that? Because you can't tell when you didn't have a crash.
Right.
But the point is that you have to have faith that if you're doing it right, then you're not going to be one of those that adds to the staggering death statistic that's going on in the United States. I have no idea what it's worldwide, but I know it's staggering in the United States.
Exactly. I mean, we're concerned about COVID, rightly so, but it doesn't seem like we have the same response when it comes to fatalities in car accidents. I mean, we lose, hundreds of thousands of people a year in car accidents. And that clearly can be avoided without a vaccine, without locking down people. All you've got to do is be more careful and drive a car that's, been safety inspected.
That's true, but the other thing is you have to have a little bit of physics knowledge, if you will. I mean, I'm not trying to get all physics on you here, but one question I ask my students all the time is, what stops the car? And the answer I always get is the same thing. I do, or the brakes. And I say, okay, try that on a frozen lake.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that it's kind of like the Scout law. The Scout law, I was a Boy Scout, and it had 2 words in it: be prepared. Driving is being prepared. In the book, I offer a defensive driving, what I call a recipe. And I don't know if you had an opportunity to see it specifically, but it's 6 letters long, and it almost spells the word spider, except that the I and the P are backwards. And it says basically search, identify, predict, decide, execute, and then repeat. And not one of those things is passive. They're all very active, and there's no place in there for a phone.
Yeah.
Or makeup or shaving or any of that.
Yeah. It's a shame, we were told that we shouldn't talk while driving. And because of that, people have taken up a much more dangerous habit, which is texting while driving. I think they feel they won't be caught if they move their hand down here and text like this, but it's just insane. I mean, your eyes are off the road. Anything could happen.
Absolutely. If you're driving 35 miles an hour down the road, you are moving over 50 feet per second. So if your eyes are off the road for 2 seconds, you just went 100 feet blind. And that's when a kid's going to walk in front of you or somebody's going to stop. Those are the kind of things that driver's education, unfortunately, is pretty much out of schools now. And I can't understand that, but the school that we've got, the driving school of Florida, that's one of the things we work on, is trying to help these kids understand that you're responsible for your actions. And, if nothing happens, yay. But when something happens, it's like going through a door that has no handle on the other side. You are stuck with the responsibilities and the consequences. There was a young girl you said you live in the area here. You may be probably familiar with Venice, Florida. And there was a young 17-year-old girl that decided to skip school one day, 10 days before Thanksgiving. She made 4 really individually minor mistakes, the end result was of those 4 mistakes is that she died. She rolled her vehicle over, and she had a hit and run, and and you look at the picture of her and you say, how does the family deal with that? I mean, instead of planning Thanksgiving, they were planning a funeral.
The family can't deal with it. The family would be crushed and heartbroken for the rest of their lives. I mean, some things you don't really come back from. If you lose a child who's a teenager, that's an immeasurable loss. And that impacts your life for the rest of your life, the siblings' lives for the rest of their lives. I remember when I was taking driver's education as a teenager, the instructor carefully told me when I went to accelerate too much, speed kills. And that stuck with me. It didn't stop me from having an accident a few months later when I went around a curve too fast on wet leaves, though, and slid into another car. I mean, because like you said, it's physics. You don't realize that, trajectory, speed, mass, and all those things come into play.
Yep. My car weighs roughly 4,000 pounds. And at 70 miles an hour, it has 10 million pounds of kinetic energy in it.
Yeah.
And when you're going that fast on the interstate, there's only one way to get rid of that energy, and that's by sliding your tires along the road in a controlled fashion or smashing into something that don't move.
Right.
And the results of that are obviously negative. But it doesn't just affect teenagers. I had the misfortune or fortune, whatever you want to call it, when I was working with the insurance company. Got a phone call from a man, middle-aged man, and he said he wanted to increase his insurance coverage. And I said, well, why don't you come on into the office and we'll go over your coverage and make sure you know what you got. Well, he says, I'm disabled, so do you think you could come to my place? And I did. I went there not knowing what I was going to be facing. This man was 45 years old, and he was a quadriplegic. And when I got into his house, he's laying in bed with his 2 children being his caregivers and his wife going back to work. And apparently he was coming home one day and a drunk driver come across the lane and hit him, and his airbag didn't go off and he broke his neck. And he's now living the rest of his life as a quadriplegic. I can't even imagine.
Yeah. And it's also such a shame because we keep on coming up with terrific safety features. First, the anti-lock brakes, and then the airbags, and then multiple airbags, and now crash detection systems. But it seems to, in many cases, just embolden drivers to be more reckless.
I think one of the most important safety devices, and in fact, people sometimes argue with me a little bit about this, but I think the most important safety device on your car is your turn signals.
Yeah.
I mean, if people know what you're going to do, since they can't read your mind, the likelihood of not having an interaction is increased. Therefore, and once again, it's one of those deals where if we didn't have a crash, do we know we didn't? But those turn signals.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't get.
Exactly.
But very true. And part of your book are a number of theorems. Tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, when I was writing the book, I started writing things, and I was going along, and I found myself repeating over and over and over again some of the same things. And I thought, well, you know what? This book's going to be 800 pages thick. So what I did is I came up with what I called Steve's theorems, and there was 10 of them. And basically what I did is I put them right up front, and so people can read them when they go into the book. And then as you read through the book, when a certain circumstance comes up, it says, see Steve's theorem number whatever for clarification on this, so that I didn't have to repeat myself over and over and over again.
Right.
And I've talked to a lot of people, and they said they found that kind of helpful. It emphasizes the points, and you can always go right back to the front of the book and read them, and they're there.
Absolutely. It kind of boils it down to a number of principles to keep in mind while you're driving. And that's always great. Now, you guys have a driving school in Florida.
Yes, sir.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Started it up about 12 years ago down in Sarasota, Florida. And did that because I was working I actually was driving for another driving school, and I enjoyed it so much. But the owner of that school wasn't a very nice, how can I say this? It wasn't, anyway.
He wasn't a very pleasant human being?
No, he wasn't. Thank you.
Let's skip over.
but what I liked the whole idea of doing it, and I loved what I was getting. I said, I can't believe they're paying money to me to do this because they're getting something. So he got to be kind of meanish, and I said, okay, I'll start my own school, and I'm glad I did. Yeah. Because then you can do things the way you want. And my effort is on taking these teenagers. I love to take somebody who has never been behind the wheel before and see them on the interstate feeling comfortable and knowing what they can and can't do. It's just such an awesome feeling. I'd do it for free if I could.
Yeah. I think it's amazing how many people have literally no clue. And part of it is they learn to drive in different countries. And you have a lot of that today where they don't understand what happens at a four-way stop sign. They don't know the difference between a solid double yellow line and a yellow line that's solid on one side and broken on the other. And so I think there's so much, there's so much lack of information and education out there.
I think, though, that's almost being self-promoted. And the reason I say that is because if you're tested when you're 16 about all of those things, and you know what the double solid lines and so forth, broken lines on one side versus the other, you're tested at 16, but you're never, ever, ever tested again, then how does it stay in your head? Especially when you see people violating it. And some of those have interesting lights on the top of their car.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And it's so they look at that and they say, well, these are the people who enforce the rules, and these are the rules that they're doing. Therefore, they must not really be the rules. And there's a degradation that goes on, and it's people looking at authority figures and doing what they do. And I really think, and this would not be popular to a lot of people to hear me say this, but I think everybody should be tested periodically, once every couple of years. I just finished with an 80-year-old woman yesterday, and she had bad eyesight, so she had to do a driver's test. And we were able to help her. She's a good driver, but she had to go through this test, and she was just terrified, because I've been driving for 65 years, and so she had some bad habits, but we were able to work with her. But that's something that ought to be done for everybody. It really is.
Absolutely. It's funny, though, there's often a push to crack down on seniors who drive, and seniors who drive really are not the problem. It's generally people under 25 years of age, don't you think?
It's actually more in the ages of 16 to 17. That's the
target group. Yeah.
They share the lion's share of the deaths and fatalities. And I've got a video that was given to me by Allstate, and it was put together by US News as well. And it has to do with teenagers that got into car crashes. And it's not so much they die, it's that they get disabled and they wind up as a paraplegic for the rest of their life. And they're telling the story, and that is so powerful. But, one girl said in it, and I never forget this, she said, for about 3 seconds when I wake up in the morning, I still think I can walk. Oh. And how do you, I can't even fathom that.
Yeah.
But it's those young teenagers, because honestly, when I was that age, I was immortal.
Exactly. The accident I told you about that I was 16 years old. I went to pick up a friend. He wasn't at his door. So I said, let me drive back to the school as quickly as possible. And that's when I found out wet leaves are as slippery as ice. And you just don't realize your own mortality at that age. You don't realize the consequences of your actions at that age. You really shouldn't be driving without an adult in the car at 16 and 17 years old. That's how I feel about it. It's that dangerous.
I agree. I always tell my students when I get done with them, I said, you have to promise me that you will not drive with any of your peers for a minimum of 3 months, preferably 6 months. And the reason for that is you got to gain experience, and you don't need to be doing it with somebody there yapping in your ear. Yeah. And, because they think it's a big social event.
You want to be cool. I remember I couldn't sit far enough back in my seat, drive the car with 1 or 2 fingers, and talk to all my friends like this while I'm driving down the road. That's just what it's like when you're 16 or 17 years old.
Exactly.
There's another aspect that I wanted to cover in there, and it's in the book, and it has to do with insurance. Yeah. I think today that people they have no understanding of how insurance works. And when I was selling insurance, I used to sell both homeowners and automobile insurance. And I had a guy come in one day, but he's in his 50s or 60s, something like that. And he says, I want to get the premium down on my policy. I said, okay, let's go over what you got. So I looked at his coverages, and he had the absolute minimum coverage that you can have. And I said, well, we can increase your deductible on collision or something and maybe save you $40 a year. And I said, it's clear to me you don't have any assets. And he says, what do you mean? I said, based on your coverage, you have no assets. He says, I have 2 apartment complexes. I said, are you serious? Somebody falls down and breaks their leg on your apartment complex, and they own your apartment complex.
Exactly.
And so what I did in here is I put what I call Insurance 101, and I break it down so that it's palatable so people can understand it. But the idea of having insurance is not something, it's green money and orange money, that kind of thing. I have to pay this premium. It's a necessary evil and all that, right up until the time you actually use it. And then all of a sudden, all the money you paid makes all kinds of sense in the world. So, exactly. But people try to get off without having it. But I think it's mostly they don't understand. And so that's in there, and I hope it helps people to understand it better.
Yeah, it's very, very important to understand. Insurance is something you hope you never need to use, but you want it there to fully cover you in the event of an accident or a mishap. And let me ask you the question, why does every other driver seem to not have a clue?
Because, and I go back to the theorems. Steve's theorem number 1 says, I believe nobody gets up in the morning, brushes their teeth, gets clothes, gets dressed, have breakfast, and goes out and get their car with the idea of being the worst driver on the road today. And nobody does. I really believe that with all my heart, unless maybe it was a terrorist or something. Right. But the idea is people go out there and they do what they're doing without any thought about what might happen, because there's a lawyer that around here that I've heard his advertisement. He says most people don't know what it's like to be in a car crash, and that's an absolutely true thing. Because if you've never been in one, how can somebody say you got to be careful because you don't want to get in a crash? They have no idea. When I do seminars for teens and churches, and I've done probably 10,000 teenagers over the last 10 years, what I do is I ask 5 questions. I say, here's a question for the entire group. How many of you in here have ever been involved in something that's known as a fender bender? And about half the people's hands go up. I was actually surprised the first time I asked it, but about half of them went up, and I said, okay, now just people hold your hands up. And I want everybody to look around. There's 2 groups of people here, people who have actually experienced it and people who think they can understand what it feels like, even though they've never been through it. And then I go on and I say, okay, how many of you got slightly hurt and needed a Band-Aid? And again, you got these 2 groups of people. And then the last one, of course, I ask is how many of you lost somebody you love? Mm-hmm. And that's something that we've experienced. And I like it when I don't see anybody else's hand up at that point. But the point is nobody believes it's going to happen to them.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. When you least expect it.
If you thought it would, you'd stay under your bed at home.
Yeah, exactly. There's this device they have in the Northeast. I don't know if they have it down in Florida. It's called the convincer. Have you ever heard of that?
No, sir.
It's almost like a sled. It's a metal, looks like a metal toboggan. You sit in it and it drops you at 5 miles an hour into the wall. And you get to feel what it's like to be in an accident hitting a stationary object at just 5 miles per hour. Oh, wow. And it does convince you that you better be careful about how you drive, because just that jolt from the 5 miles an hour is incredible.
One of the words that's been used, and I used to use it all the time too, and it was the word accident. Everybody thinks everything is an accident, and I disagree. I think there's almost no accidents. And the reason I say that is because an accident, if you look in the dictionary, is something that happened with no apparent cause. If 2 cars smack into each other, or if a car smacks into a tree, there's an apparent cause. And if somebody would have just done something differently, then it wouldn't have happened. I think an accident would be an airplane falling out of the sky and landing on your car,
Exactly.
or a space rock or something like that. So I am constantly, in fact, it's part of what I put in my book. I said, I want to discuss the difference between this. Crashes happen when people don't do what they should be doing. And it doesn't matter if you're 95% or 5% at fault. If you keep your percentage out, it can't happen. The
Exactly.
airplane.
And that's the whole point of defensive driving, is that you need to be aware that the other driver might not be doing the right thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Marianne, tell me a little bit about your role in helping Steve write this book. I imagine you're his first set of eyes.
Yeah, I did read it over a couple times for him, but I also put things in that I wanted to. When our accident happened, they told Steve that they didn't think I was going to make it.
Yeah.
And I think I woke up after 3 days and woke up just in enough time to see my parents talking to the doctor and my mother fainting. And it was like, oh no. But I am so glad, I'm glad I made it.
Yeah.
But through my life, I know that someday I am going to be with her. And
Amen.
that I'm looking forward to. And
Yeah.
her name was going to be Deanna Mary. And I talk to her all the time. People probably think I'm nuts, but I keep it quiet to myself.
Yeah.
I do, because it was just so tragic.
You know,
I'm
and
sure.
I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at the dedication page, but the book is dedicated to my wife, Marianne, who has patiently, personally, and repeatedly experienced most of my professional evaluations of all the other drivers on the road.
Yeah.
Then the second part is a book is a living memorial to a daughter who would have been our second child, one we never had. And I have a picture. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's a picture of
It's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful image. Yeah. It's an important book. It's called How's My Driving? Why Every Other Driver Doesn't Seem to Have a Clue. It's written by Steve Dziadik, and we are delighted to have Steve and Marianne, his wife, join us here today on Spotlight and open up their hearts, open up their homes to us, and talk to us a little bit about a tragedy that befell them decades ago and the work that they're doing now to right those wrongs. Steve and Marianne, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. And I really appreciated the interview. I liked your input. It was very nice.
My pleasure. I appreciate that. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.